Hello there. Springtime here in the Pacific Northwest. It's 2020 and the coronavirus is still floating around out there somewhere. So I'm being socially distant. But I'm being very intimate. Botanically speaking. And today, I'm looking for a plant that most hikers and forest dwellers try to avoid. Let's go find some. All right, here we go. We're surrounded by a field of the plant that most people don't want to be intimate with. And that's because this is stinging nettle. Now, despite the sting, there is some good reasons to get to know this plant. For one thing, it is super tasty and nutritious. Now, the way that stinging nettle stings isn't like poison oak or poison ivy. Those plants use a toxic oil that exudes over the surface of the plant. And when you touch it, it can be very problematic because once you have the oil on your fingers, you can spread it all over your body. Now, the way stinging nettle stings isn't quite so mean. It stings with these little hollow hairs called trichomes. And there's a pressurized gland that sits at the base of these hairs that basically plunges the juice of the plant underneath your skin. Now, the actual hairs don't detach like a bee sting would or a jellyfish sting. The tips of the hairs do break off, and that exposes the hollow hair. Now, people have tried to figure out what it is in the plant juice that's causing all this stinging, all this irritation. And they found a few different things, acetylcholine and serotonin and histamines and a bunch of different acids like oxalic acid and tartaric acid and formic acid. Now, formic acid is something that ants use in a super concentrated form, either in their bite or they spray it out of their abdomen onto predators. And the acid is so strong in those ants that it actually burns through flesh, kind of like stomach acid. Now, the acids in stinging nettle aren't nearly as concentrated as they are in an ant. And then you have the acetylcholine and the serotonin and the histamines. And those things are found actually in a lot of different things, in a lot of different plants and animals and fungi and bacteria, and they carry out all sorts of biological functions. We probably know them best in animals as being neurotransmitters. Histamines are probably actually best known as being part of our immune response to allergic and inflammatory reactions, like what you'd see with a stinging nettle rash. Now, all these compounds in stinging nettle definitely promote inflammation, but none of them, including the acids, are concentrated enough in stinging nettle to really be toxic or poisonous. So what is it about stinging nettle that's so irritating? Well, just like if you were to take an orange, which is tasty, non-toxic, nutritious, and actually has a lot of the same acids that stinging nettle has, and histamines, you would take that orange and suck up the juice into a hypodermic needle and then inject it underneath your skin, it's going to be irritating. And it's the same with stinging nettle. It's not that it's poisonous or toxic, it's just the way that the sting is being administered, underneath our skin. Okay, so why am I telling you all of this? Well, if you want to eat these plants, this information is good to know. Now, you actually don't even need to cook this plant to get rid of the toxins because it's not toxic. And actually, you don't even need to cook this plant to deactivate these stingers. Now, the way that these stingers inject the plant juice underneath you, that pressure that allows that juice to get underneath your skin is that same pressure that's holding up these plants. It's the same pressure that holds up all herbaceous plants, all the non-woody plants. It's the pressure of the water coming up from the ground and through this plant. Just like if you were to take a flower, cut the flower, and let it sit out for a couple hours, it's gonna wilt. And you put it back into water, and all of a sudden it inflates, and it's rigid again. So it's that pressure of the water moving through the plant that inflates these little hairs and allows the plunger, like a hypodermic needle, to push underneath your skin. So if we can wilt these plants, we can deactivate the little stinger. Now, this is stinging me, and it would be wiser to do this with gloves. But now we have wilted stinging nettle. And now it certainly stung my hand, but by rubbing it between my hands, I've basically wilted it, and it's not stinging me at all. Now, stinging nettle is very good at pulling minerals out of the ground. And you can taste the minerals in the plant. It has kind of the seaweedy taste. And a lot of people say it tastes like spinach. And it sort of does. Honestly, it's its own unique flavor, and I think it's better tasting than spinach. Now, what makes these plants so good at pulling minerals out of the ground also makes stinging nettles good at pulling pollution out of the ground, if there is any. So if you are going to pick stinging nettles, I would recommend not picking them anywhere near cities or agricultural areas where they're using pesticides and petroleum products. All that, the dioxins and heavy metals that are in that pollution can end up in your body. And, we're eating these plants, well, we should be eating these plants anyway to nourish us. And if you're eating them from a polluted area, you'd probably be having the opposite effect. And these plants do like growing in open, disturbed areas. You will find them in the city. You will find them around farmlands. Plus it's way more fun anyway to pick these in the forest. The other thing to keep in mind is they do like growing in really wet areas and near streams and rivers. So when you do go out to pick, make sure that you're not picking downstream of any pollution sources. It sucks that we have to worry about things like this, but that's just kind of the way it is. Another thing about these plants is the stinging nettle is perennial. It lives for multiple years. Now, the stalk and the leaves die out every winter, but the roots live on, and they'll develop new stalks and new leaves in the spring. So you're talking about potentially years of accumulation of pollution. Or if you're talking about a wild forested area like this, it's years of collecting all those good minerals. If you want to eat these plants raw, you don't have to crush them up between your hands. You could also chop them up really finely or put them in a food processor. And there's some really good recipes online for raw stinging nettle pesto. Another way you could deactivate and use stinging nettle is to dehydrate the nettles. One thing to keep in mind though is that some of the stingers on these nettles are bigger than others, especially the ones towards the bottom of the plant. And when you dehydrate it, even though the stinger can't inject any plant juice into you anymore, some of the little stingers are thick enough that they could still poke you, kind of like a blackberry thorn. Now, once you've dehydrated the nettles, you can do all sorts of things with it. You can make a tea with it, or it's a great addition in soups. A lot of people make, a super green superfood powder, and they sprinkle that onto dishes like you would an herb, or you put it into a smoothie. And what's great is it's this superfood that you've harvested and made yourself. Now you can also eat this nettle cooked. It's great like spinach, like a blanched spinach. Now if you do want to make a powder with the stinging nettle, I wouldn't chop it all up into a powder to store it long term. Because just like with anything, the more you chop it up, the more you're exposing the plant and all its nutrients to the oxygen in the air, and it's gonna oxidize all those nutrients in the plant. So what I typically do is I chop up the dry plant coarsely so it packs nicely into a jar. And then when I want the powder for that day, I'll grind it up in a coffee grinder. And that's really true with anything. If you keep it whole, in its whole form, it'll have a longer shelf life and all the nutrients will last longer. Now making a vinegar with stinging nettles is one of the best ways to preserve and use this plant. And that's because the acid in vinegar is really good at pulling out all the minerals and a lot of the flavors of the nettle. And it preserves it for years. Now, the way that vinegar preserves is the concentration of acid. And if you were to take fresh nettle and put it in vinegar, the water that's naturally in the nettle will dilute the vinegar and potentially dilute it to the point where it doesn't really have much of a preserving power and it'll go bad. So if you are going to make a vinegar with stinging nettle or really any plant, it's best to dehydrate it, at least partially, and then grind it up and fill it with vinegar. And then you just let it sit in a jar for about a month or so, and shake it every day if you can. And then at the end of the month, you press out all that mineral-rich and flavored vinegar through like a cotton bag, and then you toss out the plant material and you keep that vinegar. Now this plant is super nutritious. It has a bunch of vitamins, vitamin A, vitamin D, vitamin K, B vitamins. It actually has more vitamin C than an orange does by weight. It's got 40% protein by dry weight, which is pretty remarkable for a leafy green.
Oh,
it's comparable to like a dry soybean. Then you have all the minerals in stinging nettle. You have potassium, calcium, magnesium, iron, and the iron in stinging nettle is higher than that found in any plant, any edible plant. And it's non-heme iron, which is the form of iron typically found in plants. Now, heme iron is part of hemoglobin, which is a protein found in our blood that helps our blood carry oxygen in our body. Now, there's a problem with eating heme iron. the iron found in animals.
Whee!
And that's that several studies have shown that heme iron is associated with an increased chance of getting certain diseases, including heart disease and diabetes, some forms of cancer, and stroke. Now, besides all the vitamins and minerals and protein, this plant also has a bunch of phytonutrients. It has flavonoids. It has a bunch of carotenoids in it, coumarins, and phytosterols. It also has a bunch of antioxidants, and it can help regulate the inflammation in our bodies. Now, with all this good stuff in this plant, it really is more than a food, it's a medicine.
This program is brought to you by Nature's Medicine, registered trademark of life itself. Nature's Medicine has been independently tested and approved for increasing vitality by Mother Earth. Side effects may include, but are not limited to, green-stained hands, muddy shoes, euphoric frolicking, warm and tingling feelings in your heart, and increased sensations of connection to yourself and your surroundings. More information can be found by anyone with a curious mind by walking in the woods and by speaking with your friendly local neighbourhood herbalist.
And it does have a lot of historical use and current use as an herbal medicine. And there's actually been quite a few medical studies that also show its benefits. Now, stinging nettle is probably best known as a spring tonic to detoxify our body. Now, for a lot of us, wintertime is a period of relative inactivity, and a lot of us aren't eating as many fresh fruits and vegetables as we should. And stinging nettle is one of the first plants to come up in early spring. And it's kind of this wake-up call from nature. It stimulates our sluggish and atrophied tissues and gets the fluids in our body moving and gets the fluids moving out of our kidneys. So it's detoxifying through the kidneys. At the same time, these plants are so nutritious that they're also nourishing us while they're detoxifying our bodies. They're also full of antioxidants, and they can help us regulate and reduce inflammation in our body. A lot of people like using these for seasonal allergies. Now, the way that people usually use it for seasonal allergies is with a strong tea. Now, the seeds of stinging nettle, which will show up later in the summer, have their own unique medicine. They've been shown to be restorative to damaged kidneys and to the liver. They've also been shown to help with burnt out adrenal glands, kind of this adaptogenic effect. And a lot of people say they're quite energizing. And it is potent medicine, and you should certainly be cautious in how you're using it and what you're using it for. Now, this plant is also used in hair care products like shampoos because it's so nourishing and because of its anti-inflammatory properties. Now, it also has right over me. Now, this plant is also used in Now, stinging nettle is also used in hair care products like shampoos because it's so nourishing and it has those anti-inflammatory properties. But it also has these phytosterols, which actually block the formation of DHT. DHT is dihydrotestosterone, a form of testosterone that, when it's out of balance in our bodies, can actually decrease the size of the hair follicles on our scalp. So having stinging nettle in our shampoos can actually increase the thickness and life of the hairs on top of our head. That's a good thing. And those DHT blocking abilities of the phytosterols in stinging nettle also make it good in the treatment of the benign enlargement of the prostate, which is pretty common for middle-aged men and very common in elderly men. Now, the DHT blocking phytosterols are most concentrated in the roots of these plants, and that's what's typically used for treating the prostate. Now, the best time to harvest the root is in the fall, which is pretty typical when you're harvesting root medicine. And that's because the plant is pulling in all its energy, all its chi, and all of its chemistry back into the root to kind of hunker down for the winter. And so that's when all the medicine is most concentrated, is in the fall and the winter. Now, probably the most fun way to use this plant medicinally is for treating those tight, achy, arthritic joints. And the way you use it for that is by flogging yourself, by whipping yourself or somebody else with the nettles over that arthritic, tight, achy joint. Now you're actually inviting an inflammatory response when you do this. And inflammation is basically a signal for our bodies to say, hey, there's healing that needs to happen here. So by whipping an area with the stinging nettle, you're saying, hey body, hey, there's still some healing that needs to go on here. And the body responds by increasing blood flow and fluids to the area, and it begins that process of healing, of removing the damaged tissue and regenerating new tissue. Now, a lot of people are pretty allergic to this plant, so be mindful of that if you're treating yourself or somebody else with this flogging method. Now, if you're not too excited about flogging yourself to get rid of arthritic pain, this plant has been shown to help arthritis by taking it internally. And that's probably because the plant is so good at moving fluids and removing toxins and waste in our body. Now, taking this plant internally isn't going to create an inflammatory response. In fact, it helps manage excess inflammation. It's basically anti-inflammatory when taken internally. And that's certainly a good thing. We wouldn't want to take a plant internally that would cause inflammation throughout our whole bodies. You know, when you're whipping yourself with this plant to create an inflammatory response, it's localized inflammation, not systemic, body-wide inflammation, which would just be out of control, like a wildfire that has just spread everywhere. We want localized, manageable fires. There are many more uses of stinging nettle that have been discovered, and there's probably many more discoveries to be made about stinging nettle. Now, all these plants out here, all these wild plants have some gift or some message to share with us. And if we're talking about wild edible plants, there's a huge diversity of flavors and textures and sensations from these plants. And there's also this huge diversity of effects that work on a profound level as medicine for our bodies and our minds and our soul that can really help restore our vitality and help bring balance. It's pretty amazing for a little stinging plant. Now let's go get some. Not really sure what I did. I think maybe I damaged the meniscus. I'm gonna whip myself, so we'll see how this goes.